He's risen. Risen indeed. You notice that when we sing songs like that, they're forms of poetry. Perhaps that's how they actually had their origin. Somebody writing from the heart, something meaningful about their own spiritual experience, their outlook on what Christ has done in their life. But it's all in the present tense. It's not in the past tense. It's not a reference to something that is from the historical past. It's a current, present experience that's being described because Jesus is alive, because he's risen from the dead. This morning we want to look at John chapter 20. John chapter 20 recounts the first day. The first day is Sunday. The last day of the week would be Saturday, the day of the Sabbath, the rest. That's what Sabbath means, rest. And for all observers of the Old Testament, or what we call now the Old Testament, but of God's Word at that time, the Sabbath required rest, because that's when God ceased his work of creation, said it was good, and rested. And so the people were to follow that pattern, work 6 days, rest on the seventh, and the first day of the week, the eighth day, was what now we call the Sabbath. In fact, at that time, during the Roman occupation of the whole Mediterranean, because they were all provinces of the rule of the Emperor of Rome, they didn't have weekends off. They didn't have work days. Every day was a work day. They had days that were favorable, days that were unfavorable. They had festivals and holidays, but they didn't have Fridays off or Saturdays off as a rule of thumb. There was no Sabbath day or Sunday for that matter. But all four, I got a little off track there, but all four of the Gospels begin their account of the resurrection with, it was the first day of the week. And early in the morning in John 20, we're told, before the sun was up, Mary Magdalene, set out for the tomb. Now, if you read the backstory, there were guards set. There was a kind of a seal placed on the tomb because Jesus' death was somewhat notorious. He was considered by the state of Rome an insurrectionist. The religious leaders could not have put Jesus to death legally because they were clients, if you will, or subject, to be sure, to Rome. In fact, that's where Pilate comes in. He was the governor. And he was the one who rendered the charge against Jesus and his execution. The crucifixion was a slave's death. It's the lowliest form of death. It was meant to demean and shame. It was a criminal's death. The cross said, you die for your subhuman, shameful behavior in a subhuman way. I mean, I won't go into the horrors of it, but it was the most ghastly form of death possible. And yet Jesus' cross had a placard, King of the Jews. That was a mocking gesture by the Romans. And it indicated that this is what happens when you try to, in any way, even if it's an accusation or a suspicion, if you are believed to think that you are going to resist or in some insurrection oppose Rome, this is what will happen to you. We are all powerful. So the tomb was sealed. Often just the spices and the things that would be put into a tomb would be tempting to someone, and graves were often robbed. So when Mary made her way to the tomb and saw the stone of this tomb in a garden that was provided by one of the religious leaders who was sympathetic to Jesus, when she went to the garden and saw this stone rolled away, she immediately thought that somebody had robbed the grave. And she ran to Peter and John and found them still early. They raced to the tomb, we're told in John 20. In fact, we believe John was younger because he outran Peter. And then John waited at the entrance to the tomb and looked in, but Peter just went right in, which seems characteristic with the depiction of Peter in the gospel accounts. Peter went right in, but what they both noticed were the clothes wrappings there. In John 19, he mentions 75 pounds of aromatic spices that were used to, fight off putrefaction. And 75 pounds is a lot of bucks, and they would weave that into the strips of linen. John Chrysostom, who was a 3rd century Christian writer, commenting on this, says when that stuff would kind of harden, it was like lead. So to see the wrappings there, that proved it wasn't a robbery, because they wouldn't have messed with taking off the wrappings at all. They would have just taken all the spice, the wrappings and everything with them. And then Peter and John noticed that the head covering had been folded. Well, thieves don't fold. They aren't concerned with neatness. And so they were told in verse 8, chapter 20, verse 8, that John believed. And we're not told what he believed, but the implication is that he realized this was not a robbery. Something here has to do with my Lord, Jesus Christ. And perhaps John is a little ahead of the game without even seeing the Lord, in believing that he is alive. They return. Mary is outside weeping. And now she peers in, and she sees 2 messengers. The word angelos is the Greek word for messenger. But if you phonetically express that word, it sounds like angel. Angelos, angel. Especially in the Romance languages when they translate that. Angelo, for example. So she sees 2 heavenly messengers, and they ask her why she's crying. She backs away from that awesome sight, and she turns and she sees a stranger whom she takes to be the gardener, and the gardener addresses her as well. Why are you crying? And she begins to ask the gardener, where have they taken the body? If you know, we want it returned. She's very concerned. Many of them were not expecting what they got, and that was the risen Lord. They didn't know what to expect. And Mary is an example of that. And then Jesus addresses her by name, and she recognizes Jesus when she hears him speak her name. And Jesus then tells her that he wants her to tell the disciples that she has seen him, and wants them to know that he is in the process of returning to his Father, which takes place over a 40-day period. And he appears, as Paul the apostle tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he passes on to those who never saw Jesus Christ, never had that kind of, with their physical eyes, encounter with Jesus. And he says, I pass on to you in chapter 15, verses 3 and following. I pass on to you what I myself have received, that according to the scriptures, he was died, buried, and raised from the dead. Died according for our sins, was buried, raised from the dead, and appeared to, and he goes on to talk about over 500 people, even Jesus' brother James. Some of you remember from your reading of Gospels, in John 7, Jesus' brothers did not believe he was who he was. They kind of scoffed at him. And James was among them, probably the oldest of his half-brothers. And we know of James, he wrote that he too believed because Christ had appeared to him. But the turnaround on his belief is quite dramatic. In fact, he gave his life for his faith, his belief in Jesus, as is recorded in the historian Josephus. So, Jesus' appearance is a powerful impetus to believe in all the things that he had already taught them, already stood for. And even in his teaching and his beliefs, there was so much that looked to a future beyond his own life that was a part of his plans and his teachings. And so it is that I want us to focus on the fact that the night of the first day of the week, the disciples, as he tells us in chapter 20, were gathered. They were hiding from the authorities, so they locked the room, but Jesus appeared in their midst. He blessed them. He said, "Peace be upon you," which is a huge thing, especially coming from someone who has just raised up from the dead. When he says shalom, that is a blessing with great power. And he reveals himself to the disciples, but one disciple is not among them, and that's Thomas. Thomas, we know from John 11, was a very devoted disciple. In fact, he voiced his willingness to die with Jesus and kind of cajoled the rest of the disciples to follow Jesus into difficulty and danger by returning to Judea at that time. But now he's not with them. And so a week later, in a mutual and similar gathering, Jesus appears and Thomas is there. And that's what I want us to look at this morning, starting with verse 24. Let me read it to you. But Thomas, called Twin, one of the 12. By the way, twin, the very word Thomas in Greek means twin. So if you're named Tom or Thomas, Thomas in at least its Greek origin comes from the word for twin. So there may be two of you. As I was saying, one of the 12 was not with them when Jesus came, so the other disciples were telling Thomas, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "If I don't see the mark of the nails in his hands, put my fingers into the mark of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will never believe." A week later, his disciples were indoors again, and Thomas was with them. Even though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be among you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and look at my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Don't be faithless. Believe." Thomas responded to him, "My Lord, my God." And Jesus said, "Because you've seen me, you've believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." And then John concludes what we would think of as the body of his gospel, the main part. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's very striking, because as important and helpful as it is to see Jesus with our eyes, it is not necessary to know the life, the resurrection life that is ours in Jesus Christ if we believe in him. That begins a process of personal discipleship and real experience with the risen Christ. That is what John is emphasizing. It's interesting to use an illustration in his book, and this book was written a little bit back, but in his book, Rollo May, at the time of the writing of the book, Rollo May was a distinguished psychotherapist and existentialist philosopher. And he was on retreat on Mount Athos in Greece. Mount Athos has a long and storied history of monastic life and experience on that mountain, surrounded by sea. And while he was there, in Greece, it was Easter. And that Easter morning, Rollo May entered into a monastery and found himself a participant in the middle of a Greek Orthodox Eastern Easter experience, where they were celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he describes it as candlelit only, and there was kind of a smoky incense in the air. And at one point, the priest that was conducting the celebration began to move one by one, person by person, about in the crowd. And with a helper, he was distributing these very special, small tokens of Easter to each participant. And when he would place it in a participant's hands, he would say, Christos anesti, Christ is risen. And then the person who had received the gift and was looking into the face of the priest would reply, Alithos anesti, he is risen indeed. And so Rollo May tells us that at that moment, he actually uses the word, I was seized by a moment of spiritual reality. And he asks the question, what would it mean for our world if he had truly risen? So he had an experience that he describes as spiritual reality, and then he asks this question, what would it mean for our world if he was truly risen? That's an important question. What would it mean for our world if he had truly risen? And the answer is even greater, because it has made a difference in our world. I spent a lot of the week, I just kind of had to throw up my hands, and so I'm going to take a little different tack to try and give you some sense of the scope, very briefly. For example, in 2019, and not the first of its kind, but the most recent of its size, some 555 pages. Tom Holland, he's a classicist, a historian, author of several books. This is the title of his book, Dominion: How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Remade the world. And Tom Holland went on to say that so profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization that it has come to be hidden from view. In other words, we ascribe things that we take for granted to other sources, or we just believe that they were always understood this way. But actually, Holland is saying, no, that is rooted in Christianity. That is rooted in the revolutionary teaching of Jesus Christ. Even our sense of right and wrong, for example, or compassion. Well, here's another. This is a little more accessible book that you could read by John Ortberg. Who is this man? But if you look at the desk cover and you were to read the whole thing, you'll learn so much about so many things in our society that have their roots in Christianity. But the desk cover says, it talks about his influence, that is that of Jesus Christ. His influence has affected art, science, government, medicine, education, dignity, compassion, forgiveness, hope. Now, this would not be the case if the tomb was not empty, if Jesus did not rise from the dead. And the interesting thing that I find about Rollo May is that the question, what would this mean for our world? He himself responded to the priest when the priest said, Christos anesti. And what did Rollo May say? Alethos anesti. He is risen indeed. And I thought, how can you wonder and not know the answer? So I reread what I remembered, and there it was. He had so clearly said it. In his own words, each of us responded according to custom. Alethos anesti. According to custom. What does it mean when we respond according to custom? Well, we're just going along with the crowd. We're saying what everybody else is saying. We're doing what's expected of us, what's polite or what's appropriate in these circumstances. But what it also means is that I didn't have to mean a word of it. I was just following custom. I don't have to believe that he's risen. I can say the words, but it's just custom. And there's the divide. And there's the problem that I think plagues our nation and our world. Because Christians are welcoming and loving, but some people are there just because it's custom. And they haven't experienced the risen Christ. They can say the words, he is risen indeed. Indeed, in Greek, is the word truth. In truth, or truly, or in all honesty. You can express it in several ways, but what you're really saying is, I believe he's risen. Alethos anesti. He's risen in truth. The issue before us is this just custom? Not when you're dealing with the resurrection. What's to be gained? There's a book that just came out last month. I would recommend it to you. By Jeremiah Johnston, Body of Proof, the 7 best reasons to believe in the resurrection of Jesus and why it matters today. Not just in history, not as just some kind of confused impetus to a worldwide movement that's changed the world, that has no basis in historical fact, but yet it's rooted in history. The whole basis of the truth of our faith or our belief, whether it's custom to you or just the reiteration of a doctrinal statement, or whether you actually take it to heart and live your life in the light of that truth, is rooted in history. Whether you think it's historical or not, you're going to have to deal with it in real history. And that should tell you something. Christianity is not a mystical, superstitious religion. It's rooted in what God has done in history, and the proof of that going both directions, back in time to the beginning of the Old Testament or the Bible, and forward into the future, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The middle of time, if you will. And it changes everything. It changes the way we see the world. It changes the way we live our lives. It brings about change. German theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg, he is an important theologian that we've probably never heard. Probably one of the most important of the second half of the 20th century. In 1997, he did an interview with Prism magazine, which was just a more popular, because I've got 4 of his big, thick books. Very astute, brilliant thinker and theologian. But in that article, he wrote this, or it is written of his interview: the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is so strong that nobody would question it, except for 2 things. Here are the 2 nubs of why people, in his estimation, and this is a man who knows that other theologians, not all, but many, other philosophers will poo-poo what he has to say about the resurrection. And these are the fundamental reasons, whether you're a bigwig academic or you're just another common person like you and me. And this is what he says. The first is, it's a very unusual event. Now that's what we call understatement. That's academic understatement. But it is a very unusual event. In other words, it's not replicable. In science, our science is based on replicating things. The hardest sciences can be replicated. If it can't be replicated, then it can't be ultimately scientific truth. And when you have an unusual event like this, is there no then place within your science? Even if you're a scientist at heart, as a philosopher, you're dealing with things in the world that are beyond our ability to touch with our hands, see with our eyes, hear with our ears. If there's no room for truth outside of that hard science, we're in big trouble. Because we all know there's more to this world than that. And that's what he's referring to. Where's the place in your science, in your worldview, for an unusual, a highly unusual event? Some would say God can't break into this world that he made. Just think about that. The second thing he says is, if you believe it happened, you have to change the way you live. In other words, he's not saying that you have to change to believe. In his German, maybe his poor English, what he's saying is that if you believe the resurrection, this unusual event, this inbreaking of God in the desert of history, if you will, then it's got to do something to you. It's got to change. It's got to have full meaning. And isn't that what Rollo May was saying? He had this moment of spiritual reality, and he was seized by it. And he came out with this question: what would it mean for our world if he had truly risen? That's what Pannenberg's referring to. People don't think that it is going to make a difference in them. They don't realize it's not just fighting over whether a resurrection could occur. It's a resurrection of God's sent Son for a purpose, and it validates everything he taught and said and what has been passed on. And it validates the history of God's work in the world to that point, and the history of God's work beyond that point into eternity and our future and our worldview. Of course it helps if we're there, if we could have seen him with our physical eyes. But remember, he is risen. He lives. And you'll hear from people again and again and again throughout history, their lives have been changed by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I knew a kid. He was new to our neighborhood. He was a nice kid. I met him in the 4th grade. He joined our school. You know, when you move into an area, you get registered into the school that you live near. And so he joined our school. He was a littler guy, kind of fragile looking. He had these super big ears. And the kids made fun of him. He just wanted to fit in, but they made fun of him. And they started calling him Dumbo. Now, some of you wouldn't remember, but this kid, this was at a time when Disneyland came out with an animated elephant story that had big ears, and it could flap its ears and fly. And so they started calling this kid Dumbo. And he didn't like that, and so he started teasing people back. And then he started picking fights and getting into trouble. He developed a bad attitude, all for trying to be something he wasn't liked. Well, we graduated in middle school to the same school. We weren't as close at that point. He started hanging out with some other kids. Sometimes the kids that don't quite fit in, they fit together. You know what I mean? And they get together. And so we kind of went our separate ways. Again, I don't know, it was hard to see him dropping out of things, hanging out with some of these other friends, and really kind of getting into trouble. I'd see him around the neighborhood and make small talk. I invited him to play baseball with us once. We played at a nearby park, and he wasn't really good athletically, so we had him pitch, which was kind of underhanded. It was all about fielding, but there was this pop-up right to him, and he dropped it. And everybody started giving him a bad time, calling him Bush League, which is kind of a baseball term for you're lousy. And then that name stuck, calling him Bush. It was a time that, well, it was kind of the last time he ever came out and did anything with us in that way. In high school, I didn't want to be around him much. He was ditching classes, leaving campus. And when he'd leave campus, he was getting loaded because back in class, you could tell he was loaded, and he was loud. He was disruptive. And when he wasn't loaded, and if he was in class, he was quiet and he was disinterested. One time during class, I caught him cheating. And I think in the past, he would have tried to cover that up. He just smiled at me. I know he got into trouble with the cops a couple of times. His parents were nice people. They didn't know anything about what was going on. You know, I knew them when I was younger, and they were just hardworking, good people. I guess it was after high school, after his first year of junior college, that it happened. One night he left, and he just never came back. You know, I tried to help him. Even when you're young, we're kind of clumsy. We're not as sophisticated. We don't know sometimes how to help, but we try. But sometimes it's just never enough. And even when we're sophisticated and we have knowledge and we have a bigger heart and a greater desire to help people, if a person doesn't want to be helped, you can't help them. It's the most frustrating. It can really sadden a person when you're trying to help somebody and you can't help them. It's frustrating. Anyway, they never found that kid. I don't think his parents really understood what happened to him, but I know what happened to him. And now you do too, because I'm that kid. That night, and listen, if you can understand, I want you to realize that kid died that night. And I was resurrected. Because that night I believed that Jesus rose from the dead, that in his death. Now I had heard those things, but that night I believed it. It wasn't custom. It wasn't being dragged to church. That night alone, when I went out into the dark, I believed those things. I believe that in Jesus' death, God demonstrated, God showed me, God expressed his heart to me, that he loves me. And I believe he expresses that love for you in his death. And I believe that in his resurrection, I became the recipient. In other words, in his love, I can embrace God. I don't have to fear God. I don't have to keep my distance from God. God personalizes it in every single way. And Jesus is the reality of that. And so it is. I really have trouble with a Rollo May. And by the way, you'll have to forgive me if I talk about myself in the third person, but I'm so different than that kid. It's like I read a novel. That's not me anymore. And that's how real the resurrection is to a life that's lived in the power of the resurrection, which is the work of God's Spirit in us, the indwelling Christ that is ours. That's why I have trouble with Rollo May and how he could just go through the motions. But you know what? That was exactly what I was doing. It was just custom. Maybe today for someone here, it will become more than custom and it will become real. The thing that I find hard about this for Rollo May is Rollo May was a distinguished existentialist. You know, the one thing an existentialist would not say is that this question, as he put it, this question, if he really lived, what it would mean for our world. That's not the way an existentialist would pose that question. A good existentialist says, what would it mean for me? First and foremost. Any existentialist philosopher worth his authenticity, claims of authenticity, expressions of will, would begin with the reality of it for himself. And if he couldn't believe it for himself, if he couldn't experience it for himself, if he wouldn't be authentic for himself, he wouldn't talk about the world around him at all on that subject. Because if it isn't real here, then it ain't going to be real out there. And it ain't going to be real in my mind that it's real for anybody else. Have you ever heard of Alfred H. Ackley? He was asked by a fellow student, What difference does it make for me? Why should I worship a dead Jew? And Ackley replied, he lives. He's not dead. He's more alive today than ever. And that experience became for him a poem and then a song called He Lives. He lives. There's a line he says, because he claimed he could prove Jesus is alive by his own experience. And so there's a line that in the song that was published back in 1933, you ask me how I know he lives. He lives within my heart. You know, I was alone. There was no pastor around. I hadn't been going to church. I'd been in search. If you'd seen me walking in the dark, you wouldn't have known that I was fighting with God. And I was by a canal bank. And without any help, anyone around, I talked to God. And I asked him to be my Lord. And I began my walk in Christ. And I found a church. And I became attached to a body of people. And I believed that I could make a difference in this world, whereas I'd been sponging and doing nothing but wasting my life. I began to live a life that was constructive, added something to life. You can too if you don't know Jesus Christ. You don't need me. You need him. And you can talk to him because he lives. He lives. He lives.